Greetings, everyone, and welcome to my new podcast, History with Harun. I'm your host, Timothy Harun. I'm an actor, screenwriter, model, and journalist, and I'll be using humor to educate my viewers and listeners about current events. I hold a bachelor's degree in journalism with an emphasis in political science. My goal is to use this podcast as an opportunity to reach people who want to hear interesting conversations about spirituality, politics, and current events. My unique viewpoints are designed to provoke critical thinking, both within myself and amongst audience. As a journalist, I've worked in production at large corporations such as CNN and also written for smaller publications like the HBCU Digest and Toward Freedom. After years of allowing journalism to take a back seat to my acting ambitions, recent world events have pushed me to become more vocal in terms of my political activism. So I'd like to start the first episode with a discussion about the system of racism, white supremacy, and how it affects the current reality of how things function in America, and also how it affects global affairs as well. So, racism and white supremacy is a system that affects all areas of human activity, from economics to education to entertainment to labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. For the purpose of this episode, we're going to focus on war. And who exactly does this system of racism, white supremacy protect? Well, this structure is designed to protect white people. It allows white leadership to invade non-white countries under false pretenses, i.e., the war in Iraq. In 2003, Iraq was invaded based off the idea that the country possessed weapons of mass destruction. However, that proved to be a lie. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. But unfortunately, because minority groups are not considered equal to whites, they don't have the same protections. We see that with how Western nations treat African and Middle Eastern nations. We also see a lack of protection towards non-white groups here in America. For example, in 2021, the FBI reported 5,203 missing Native American women, disappearing at a rate equal to more than 2.5 times their share of the US population. Think about that. However, this is not considered a domestic crisis because these women are not white. Moving forward, it's important that we understand the terminology that is used within this system of racism and white supremacy. Especially the term terrorism. It's something that is thrown out a lot. It's thrown around a lot. It's a very popular term in the discourse for justifiable reasons. People are losing their lives on a global scale and a domestic scale as well. And what is and isn't considered terrorism is hotly debated and has been hotly debated over at least the last 100 years. So it's important to understand that there is no international agreed upon definition of terrorism. The reality is that different nations function differently. There are democracies, dictatorships, monarchies, etc., that have different systems that aid their methods of governance. According to dictionary.com, the definition of terrorism is the unlawful use of violence or threats to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or government with the goal of furthering political, social, or ideological objectives. This is where things get interesting Because there are minute differences between war and terrorism. And often the line between the two is rather blurred. So, one of the most widely disputed points of contention is state sponsored violence versus sub state sponsored violence. The state of Israel is not considered a terrorist group. However, Hamas is. The ability to label what is and is not terrorism isn't dictated by which group is the most violent. It's about which group has the most power. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the Hamas led attacks on October 7th of last year led to the deaths of about 1,400 Israelis. About 1,200 were killed in the attack, and about 200 have died since, as of March 5th. On the other side, the state of Israel has killed over 30,000 Palestinians since October 7th. That's more than 20 times the amount of people that Hamas has killed. However, Hamas is considered a terrorist group, thus justifying the indefinite bombing of the region some of its members occupy. Meanwhile, Israel is not being hit with the same terrorist label by the US or the UN, thus further allowing their indefinite occupation and grave destruction of Palestinian life. Why should Black and brown people care about this issue? Because it's further proof that settler colonialism is alive and well. Currently, Black Americans are paying taxes to support Israel's occupation. However, Black Americans have not been paid the reparations that were promised for their role in providing the free labor that helped build America into the power that it is today. Hamas is considered a terrorist group partly because they use violence to achieve their goals, but also because this labeling enables the use of disproportionate force and violence against Palestinian civilians at the hands of the Israeli government. It was only 60 years ago that the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, considered the Black Panther Party a terrorist group and the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. Though history has proven that the Black Panther Party was not a terrorist group, that rhetoric was used to justify the FBI-led assassinations of Black Panther Party members Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And to add insult to injury, there's been no criminal accountability as it relates to those cases. A federal grand jury failed to indict anyone who was involved in the planning and execution of the raid that killed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. The way the US addresses the issue of terrorism needs to be reconsidered. Let's take, for instance, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. This is an active terrorist organization that at certain points spread from the US all the way to South America, to Asia, and to even Africa. Though responsible for thousands of acts of terror against civilian groups, at no point did the American government or any other government consider bombing the areas where KKK members reside. It would just be an absurd proposition. Partially because doing such would lead to the massive loss of life for civilian populations in many areas, but most importantly, the US, because that's where the KKK is concentrated and still exists and operates to this day without the threat of being bombed by anyone. Meanwhile, the US is sponsoring an indefinite bombing campaign that is destroying civilian life in Palestine. And the justification is that even though these bombs are mostly destroying women and children, they are designed to kill the bad guys, the terrorists, Hamas, which some of them have. The Israeli embassy says that they've killed 10,000 members of Hamas, but it's hard for them to tell them apart from civilians because many of them do not wear military uniform. Now that's 10,000 out of 25,000 total members. That means that if the embassy is correct in its estimate, it would have to kill, or Israel would have to kill, another 30,000 civilians just to take out another 10,000 members of Hamas. That would put the Palestinian death toll at 60,200 and the Israeli death toll at 1,200, with 5,000 members of Hamas remaining. The reality is that Zionism is not sustainable. It never was. Throughout the late 1800s, Theodor Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism, worked very diligently alongside other Zionists to draft proposals that would lead to the creation of an official Jewish state. And he was successful. Even though he passed away 16 years before the establishment of British Mandate Palestine in 1920, he helped lay the groundwork for the Balfour Declaration, which was a public statement issued by the British government in 1917, announcing its support for the establishment of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. During the British Mandate, there were massive waves of Jewish immigration in Palestine, which led to Jewish nationalism. While there's nothing inherently wrong with Jewish immigration or Jewish nationalism, Zionism is distinct from other forms of nation building due to its loose connection with the Bible. Throughout the Torah, God mentions many things through his prophets. It's a big book. But one of the themes, constant throughout the Torah, is God's connection and promise to restore his, quote, chosen people to a promised land in the same territory they cultivated after Moses delivered them from Pharaoh, from slavery. What makes this promise unique is that God told Moses that his chosen people will be able to dwell in this land forever, literally until the end of time. Now, immigration isn't the issue. People migrate everywhere all the time. It's not a problem. The issue is that in 1920, the British government decided that they spoke to either God or Moses, and that God or Moses told them that it was time to turn Palestine into a region that would allow open-ended Jewish immigration and land purchases at the expense of Arab independence. Now, part of the argument in favor of Zionism is that prior to the creation of Israel, the Jewish people did not have an official state. Well, technically, currently, Black Americans don't have an official state. But if we were to establish a, quote, Black mandate in a country that already exists and then show up and forcibly remove those inhabitants from their homes off the strength of our Blackness, we wouldn't get indefinite financial support from the US, Britain, and the UN. Lastly, you don't have to take my word for it. In the late 1800s, there were plenty of Jewish intellectuals who met with Herzl and warned him about the dangers of Zionism and the violence it would cause. There was Lucien Wolfe, an English journalist, diplomat, and historian who co-founded the Anti-Zionist League of British Jews, a group that opposed Zionism because they believed that it would lead to anti-Semitism, as well as Edwin Montagu, a British liberal politician who was also Jewish, who in 1917 called Zionism a mischievous political creed that was anti-Semitic. Now, there's more history as it relates to the founding of Israel, and I would love to get into that at a later episode. But for now, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. And before I leave, I would like to close with a passage from the Quran to honor the blessed and wonderful, beautiful month of Ramadan, and to honor all the sacrifices and prayers that are being made around the globe, but specifically in Palestine. So, reading from chapter 16, the B, verses 15 through 25. Quote, "He set firm mountains upon the earth, lest it should move away with you, and rivers, roads, and landmarks, so that ye may be rightly guided. By the stars, too, are men directed. Is he then who has created like him who cannot create? Will you not take heed? If you reckoned up God's blessings, you cannot count them. God is forgiving and merciful. God has knowledge of what you conceal and what you reveal. The gods which infidels invoke create nothing. They are themselves created. They are dead, not living. Nor do they know when they will be raised to life. Your God is one God. Those that deny the life to come have faithless hearts and are puffed up with pride. God surely knows what they conceal and what they reveal. He does not love the proud." Thank you all for tuning in to the first episode of History with Harun. If you like the content, please subscribe to the YouTube page and please contribute to what I'm doing here. It would really, really go a long way. You can donate at Cash App History with Harun. Again, I hope you all enjoyed the first episode, and blessings. Take care.